Tonight, you're going to smell medieval Europe. No showers, no deodorant, no plumbing, and sometimes no clean water at all. And somehow, people still tried to stay clean. The question is, how? Welcome to Quiet History. Now, get comfortable.
Before the first pipe carried water through a wall, before the first ceramic tile lined a bathroom floor, before the concept of a private, heated, on-demand wash existed in any form, there was still cleanliness. It simply looked, smelled, and felt entirely different from anything a modern observer would recognize. The medieval world of Europe, spanning roughly the 12th through the 15th centuries, was a place of extraordinary sensory density. A traveller arriving at the edge of a typical market town at dusk in the year 1300 would have encountered a landscape that assaulted every sense simultaneously. Rain-soaked cobblestones reflected the last pale light of a winter sky. Narrow streets, barely wide enough for two people to pass shoulder to shoulder, channeled the day's runoff toward open drainage channels cut into the stone and earth below. The smell was layered and complex. Wood smoke drifting from 100 hearths, the sharp ammonia of animal dung from horses and pigs that shared the streets with people, the fatty, slightly rancid scent of tallow candles burning behind oiled parchment windows, and beneath it all, the damp, organic smell of wet wool and unwashed leather. This was not a world without order. It was a world with a different order, one built around the physical realities of what water cost in terms of labor, what fire cost in terms of fuel, and what time cost in terms of survival. Understanding medieval hygiene requires first understanding the physical environment that shaped it, because the architecture of daily life determined everything about how people interacted with cleanliness. The homes of ordinary medieval Europeans were low, timber-frame structures with walls of wattle and daub, woven branches packed with a mixture of clay, straw, and animal dung that dried into a surprisingly effective insulating material. Roofs were thatched with straw or reed, and they leaked, not catastrophically, but persistently. A slow seep of moisture that kept the interior air damp and encouraged the growth of mold in the lower corners of walls. Floors were earthen, packed hard by years of foot traffic, sometimes strewn with rushes or dried herbs to absorb moisture and manage the smell of daily life. There were no ceilings in the modern sense. The interior of the roof was visible, its beams blackened by years of smoke from the central hearth that occupied the middle of the main room. That hearth was the center of everything. It provided heat, light, and the means to cook food and warm water. But it also filled the room with smoke, because chimneys, while not unknown, were far from universal in ordinary homes before the later medieval period. Smoke rose, found its way through gaps in the thatch, and left behind a permanent haze that stung eyes and coated every surface with a thin film of carbon. The walls of these homes were not clean in any modern sense. They were functional, they kept out wind and rain, but they accumulated the residue of daily life in layers that built up over years. Into this environment, consider the objects that define the relationship between people and water. Wooden buckets, their staves held together by iron bands, sat near doorways and beside hearths. Clay jugs, with narrow necks and wide bases, stood on earthen shelves, holding water carried from the nearest well or stream. Iron cauldrons, heavy and black with use hung from iron hooks over the hearth fire, their contents slowly heating toward a temperature useful for washing. Shallow ceramic basins, often no deeper than a few inches, served as the primary washing vessels for hands, faces, and feet. These were not decorative objects. They were tools, worn and practical, and their presence in every home tells a story about a society that took the act of washing seriously enough to maintain dedicated equipment for it. The persistent myth that medieval people were universally filthy, that they never bathed, never washed their clothes, and lived in a state of permanent biological squalor is one of the most durable and most thoroughly incorrect assumptions about the pre-modern world. The historical record tells a different story. Medieval people bathed regularly, using water and clean linen as their primary tools. They took hygiene seriously and made considerable efforts to maintain their cleanliness despite obstacles that would seem insurmountable by modern standards. The difference was not in the desire for cleanliness, but in the infrastructure available to pursue it. What medieval Europeans lacked was not the motivation to be clean. Time equal sign, 900 milliseconds. What they lacked was the pipe, the invisible pressurized, always available column of water that modern life treats as a basic right did not exist. Every drop of water used for washing had to be found, carried, and heated by human effort. This fundamental physical reality shaped every aspect of medieval hygiene. The frequency of bathing, the methods used, the social structures built around communal washing, and the ingenious substitutes developed when water was scarce or inaccessible. The broader landscape of medieval hygiene infrastructure was built around the natural world in ways that modern sanitation has entirely replaced. Rivers were the great multi-purpose resource of the medieval world, simultaneously the source of drinking water, the site of laundry washing, the destination for waste, and the power source for mills that ground grain, and in some cases drove bellows for metalworking. The same river that a washerwoman used to rinse linen at dawn might receive the runoff from a tannery upstream, and the drainage from a town's central channel downstream. The medieval relationship with rivers was intimate and unsentimental. They were used fully, without the modern luxury of separating clean water infrastructure from waste infrastructure. Communal wells occupied the centers of village squares and town marketplaces throughout medieval Europe. These were not simple holes in the ground. They were engineered structures, stone-lined shafts, sunk to the water table, equipped with wooden frames, rope and pulley systems, and iron-banded wooden buckets worn smooth by generations of daily use. The well was a social space as much as a practical one. It was where people gathered in the early morning to collect the day's water supply, where news was exchanged, where the rhythms of community life were reinforced by the shared necessity of this daily task. Monasteries represented the most sophisticated hygiene infrastructure of the medieval world. Many monastic complexes were built with remarkable attention to water management. Carved stone channels directed rainwater and spring water through the complex, feeding stone cisterns, lavabo basins for hand washing before meals, and the river daughter, the communal latrine, built over a running water channel that flushed waste away continuously. The rule of Saint Benedict, which governed daily life in Benedictine monasteries across Europe, emphasized cleanliness as a component of spiritual discipline, and the physical infrastructure of these communities reflected their priority in stone and mortar. The seasons governed everything about medieval hygiene. Summer brought longer days, warmer water in rivers and streams, and the possibility of outdoor washing on a scale that winter made impossible. Spring was the great cleaning season, the time when bedding was aired, when walls were whitewashed with lime, when the accumulated debris of winter was cleared from homes and lanes. Winter contracted the possibilities of washing, drove people closer to hearth fires, and made the labor of heating water even more demanding against the background of cold that penetrated timber walls and earthen floors. What emerges from this survey of the medieval physical environment is not a picture of ignorance or neglect, but of adaptation. Medieval people understood that cleanliness mattered for health, for social standing, for spiritual well-being, and for the basic comfort of daily life. They built systems to achieve it within the constraints of their world, communal bathhouses that made the labor of heating water efficient. By sharing it, laundry practices that used natural cleaning agents with remarkable chemical sophistication, and personal hygiene routines that prioritized the visible and the practical. The story of medieval cleanliness is ultimately a story about human ingenuity operating under constraint. It is a story told through objects, buckets and basins, cauldrons and clay pots, wooden tubs and linen cloths, and through spaces. The riverbank at dawn, the bathhouse at midday, the well at the center of the village square. It is a story that challenges the comfortable modern assumption that cleanliness is a recent invention and replaces it with something more interesting and more true. Cleanliness in the medieval world was not absent. It was present in every household, every community, and every season, structured around entirely different systems, rhythms, and resources than the ones that define modern life, but no less real and no less human for that difference. The stone rim of a medieval well, worn into smooth curves by 10,000 hands gripping its edge, tells a story that no written record can fully capture. It is a story measured in daily repetition, the same gesture, performed at the same hour by generation after generation of people for whom water was not a convenience, but a labor. In the villages and towns of medieval Europe, the well was the fixed point around which daily life organized itself. Stone-lined shafts sunk deep into the earth, their interiors cool and dark, their surfaces slick with moisture. These structures were among the most carefully maintained pieces of infrastructure in any community. The wooden frame above the shaft, a simple but precisely engineered structure of upright posts and a crossbeam, supported the rope and pulley system that made the work of drawing water possible. The rope itself was a significant object. Thick, twisted from plant fiber, regularly replaced when wear made it dangerous, and kept coiled on a wooden drum that turned on an iron axle worn bright by constant use. The bucket at its end was iron-banded wood, its staves swollen tight with water, its handle polished smooth by the grip of countless hands. The physical act of drawing water from a deep well was not trivial. A full bucket of water weighed considerably, and the labor of raising it hand over hand, or winding the drum against the weight of the column below, was real physical work performed multiple times each day. For a household requiring water for drinking, cooking, and washing, The morning trip to the well was not a brief errand, but a sustained effort. Multiple trips, multiple buckets, the water transferred into clay storage vessels or wooden barrels that would serve the household through the day. Some of the most sophisticated water infrastructure of the medieval period existed not in villages, but in castles. At Rochester Castle in England, the architectural record reveals a remarkable system. Wells positioned so that water could be drawn at every level of the keep, using a network of buckets and ropes running inside the walls themselves. This meant that servants did not need to carry water up multiple flights of stone stairs. Instead, the infrastructure of the building did the work of vertical transport. At Chester Castle, lead wooden and ceramic pipes carried water from cisterns to the keep and kitchens below, a system of pressurized distribution that anticipated, in rudimentary form, the logic of modern plumbing. These were exceptional cases, the products of significant investment and engineering knowledge, but they demonstrate that the medieval world was not without ambition when it came to water management. Beyond the well, the river was the other great source of water for medieval communities. The banks of rivers near towns and villages were shaped by use, paths worn into the earth by the daily passage of people carrying buckets and baskets, flat stones positioned at the water's edge to provide stable footing, and in some locations, shallow stone steps cut directly into the bank to allow access at different water levels. The river was democratic. In a way the well was not. It required no infrastructure to access, no maintenance, no communal agreement about its use. It simply flowed, available to anyone who could reach it, its surface carrying the light of morning sky and the reflections of the trees and buildings that lined its banks. Monasteries represented a different relationship with water entirely. Monastic communities across Europe invested heavily in water management infrastructure, carving channels from stone to direct spring water and rainwater through their complexes with precision. Cisterns, large underground chambers lined with waterproof mortar, collected and stored water against the dry months when springs ran low. The physical evidence of these systems survives in the archaeological record. Carved stone channels worn smooth by centuries of flowing water. Carved stone channels worn smooth by centuries of flowing, the outlines of cistern walls visible in excavated foundations, and the stone lavabo basins where monks washed their hands before meals, their surfaces polished by generations of daily use. Once water was collected, it had to be transported. The carrying pole, a simple wooden yoke balanced across the shoulders, with buckets or vessels suspended from each end, was among the most universal tools of medieval life. It distributed the weight of water across the body's strongest structures, allowing a person to carry significantly more than they could manage with hands alone. The physical evidence of this practice is visible in the wear patterns on stone thresholds and doorways. The smooth, the slightly lowered patches, where the edges of buckets brushed against stone thousands of times over decades of daily passage. Heating water was the next great labor in the chain that connected the well to the washing basin. Iron cauldrons, heavy and black, with accumulated carbon from years of hearth fire, were the primary vessels for this work. Suspended from iron hooks on adjustable chains above the hearth, they could hold significant volumes of water but bringing that volume to a useful temperature required time and fuel, both precious resources in a medieval household. The process was slow, measured in the gradual appearance of steam rising from the surface in the small bubbles that formed along the cauldron's inner walls before full boiling began. Fuel had to be gathered, split, and dried before it could burn efficiently, and the management of the hearth fire was a skilled domestic task that determined the temperature and timing of everything that depended on heat. The shallow wooden tubs that served as bathing vessels in medieval homes were objects of considerable practical value. Made from staved wood bound with iron hoops, they were watertight but not deep. A person sitting in one would have water reaching perhaps to the waist, their knees drawn up against the curved inner walls. Filling such a tub required multiple cauldrons of heated water, carried from the hearth and poured carefully to avoid scalding. The entire process of preparing a bath, from drawing water at the well to sitting in a filled tub, might occupy the better part of a morning, which explains why bathing was not the daily ritual it has become in the modern world, but rather a significant domestic event, planned and prepared for with deliberate effort. The laundry environment of medieval Europe was centered on the river or stream, and the physical evidence of this practice is written into the landscape in ways that persist to the present day. Flat stones positioned at the water's edge, their upper surfaces worn into smooth, slightly concave depressions by centuries of wet fabric being beaten against them, survive at numerous sites across Europe. These washing stones were not accidental features. They were selected for their flatness and stability, positioned where the current was accessible but not dangerously fast, and used by generations of washerwomen who knelt or crouched at the water's edge to work fabric against their surfaces. The tools of medieval laundry were simple but effective. Wooden paddles, flat-bladed implements roughly the size and shape of a cricket bat, were used to beat wet fabric against washing stones, driving water and loosened dirt through the weave of the cloth. Scrubbing boards, their surfaces ridged with parallel grooves, cut into the wood, provided a textured surface against which fabric could be rubbed to dislodge embedded soil. After washing, wet linen was carried to open fields and spread across grass or draped over hedgerows to dry in whatever air and light the season provided. The bleaching effect of sunlight on wet linen was understood and exploited. Fabric left on grass in morning dew, and sunlight emerged, whiter than fabric dried indoors, a fact that shaped the geography of laundry as a seasonal outdoor practice. The primary cleaning agent of the medieval world was lye, a caustic, alkaline solution produced from wood ash and water that served as the universal solvent for grease, dirt, and biological matter. Its production was a domestic process performed in every household that maintained a hearth fire, which meant virtually every household in medieval Europe. The ash pit behind a medieval home was not waste. It was a resource. Wood ash from the hearth was collected in clay pots and earthenware vessels, accumulated over weeks and months, and then processed into lye, through a method that was ancient even by medieval standards. The leaching barrel, a hollowed log or staved wooden vessel with a small hole near its base, was the production vessel for lye. Ash was packed into the barrel in layers alternating with straw, which acted as a filter. Water was poured over the ash from above and allowed to percolate slowly downward through the layers, dissolving the soluble alkaline compounds from the ash as it descended. The liquid that dripped from the hole at the base was lye, pale, slightly oily in appearance, with a sharp, slightly oily, biting smell, and a caustic quality that could burn skin on prolonged contact. Medieval householders tested the strength of their lye by floating a feather on its surface. If the feather floated, the solution was strong enough for use. If it sank, the lye needed further concentration. Lye was used directly in laundry, added to the water in which fabric was soaked and boiled to break down grease and organic matter. It was also the essential ingredient in soap production, combined with rendered animal fat in a process that transformed two common waste products into a cleaning agent of remarkable effectiveness. The ash pit, the leaching barrel, and the soap maker's cauldron formed a connected system, a closed loop of resource use that characterized medieval domestic economy at its most efficient. The full chain of medieval washing, from drawing water at the stone-lined well, to carrying it home on a yoked pole, to heating it slowly in an iron cauldron, to beating fabric against riverside stones, to spreading wet linen across cold morning fields, was a labor that structured the rhythm of daily life in ways that modern domestic technology has made entirely invisible. Every clean garment, every washed basin, every scrubbed floor represented hours of physical work performed by human hands against the resistance of cold water, heavy iron, and stubborn dirt. The medieval world was not clean by accident or by convenience. It was clean by effort, sustained, skilled, and daily effort that left its marks in the worn stone of well rims, the smooth concavities of riverside washing stones, and the polished surfaces of iron cauldrons blackened by 1,000 fires. In the narrow streets of a medieval town, on a cold winter morning, there was one building that announced itself before it came into view. The steam rose first, thin white columns curling upward from gaps in the roof and around the edges of heavy wooden doors, visible against the grey sky from half a street away. The smell followed, heated water carrying the sharp green notes of rosemary and the soft sweetness of lavender cutting through the ambient odors of the street like something from another world entirely. The medieval public bathhouse was one of the most significant and most misunderstood institutions of the pre-modern world. Known in German-speaking regions as the bathhouse and in French territories as the étuves, these establishments existed in virtually every town of meaningful size across medieval Europe. They were not marginal or disreputable places, at least not in their earlier centuries of operation. They were essential civic infrastructure, as fundamental to the functioning of urban life as the market or the mill, and they were used by people across the social spectrum with a regularity that modern audiences rarely associate with the medieval period. The physical architecture of the bathhouse was shaped entirely by its function. These were low, timber-framed buildings, typically positioned near a river or stream. The proximity to flowing water was not incidental, but essential, since the volumes of water required for continuous operation demanded a reliable source that could be accessed without the labor of well drawing. Some bathhouses were built directly over or beside watercourses, their foundations incorporating stone channels that directed water into the building's heating system. Others were positioned close enough to a river that water could be carried in large wooden barrels on wheeled carts, replenishing the supply as the day's bathing drew it down. The exterior of a bathhouse was recognizable by its signage, typically a bundle of leafy branches or a painted wooden sign depicting a tub or a figure bathing, and by the physical evidence of its operation visible from the street. Heavy wooden doors, reinforced with iron straps and fitted with thick leather seals along their edges, were designed to retain the steam that was the bathhouse's primary product. When those doors opened to admit a customer, a brief exhalation of warm, herb-scented air escaped into the cold street, a sensory advertisement more effective than any painted sign. Stepping inside, the transition from street to bathhouse was immediate and total. The low ceiling, blackened by years of accumulated smoke and steam, pressed the warm air downward. Stone or clay floors, worn smooth by generations of bare feet, were slightly warm to the touch from the heat radiating upward through the building structure. The light was dim. Small windows fitted with oiled parchment or thin scraped animal membrane admitted a diffuse yellowish glow that barely penetrated the steam, filling the interior air. Wooden benches, their surfaces darkened and smoothed by years of use, were arranged around the perimeter of the main bathing room and around the central heating apparatus, either a large iron cauldron suspended over a fire pit, or in more sophisticated establishments, a stone structure that held heated rocks over which water could be ladled to produce bursts of steam. The sound environment of the bathhouse was distinctive and layered. The hiss of water striking heated stone was the constant background note, a sharp, immediate sound followed by the rushing expansion of steam into the room's air. Wooden ladles, dipping into buckets and rising again. Water dripping from wet surfaces back into collection basins. The creak of wooden benches under shifting weight. These sounds composed a domestic acoustic landscape entirely different from the noise of the street outside. The physical objects found inside a medieval bathhouse reflected a sophisticated understanding of the bathing process that drew on traditions reaching back through centuries of European practice. Wooden scraping tools adapted from the Roman strigil, a curved implement originally made from bone or metal, used to scrape oil, sweat, and loosen dirt from the skin's surface, were among the standard equipment of the bathhouse attendant. The medieval versions were simpler than their Roman predecessors, often flat wooden blades with a slight curve, but their function was identical to mechanically remove from the skin the material that hot water and steam had loosened. Bundles of dried herbs hung from the ceiling beams and were placed in the heating water to release their volatile compounds into the steam. Lavender, rosemary, wormwood, and mint were among the most commonly documented herbs used in this way, their selection reflecting both their availability and their understood properties. Lavender for its pleasant scent and believed calming effects. Rosemary for its sharp form, penetrating aroma. Wormwood for its reputation as a repellent of insects and parasites. Mint for its cooling sensation. On heated skin. The herbs were not merely decorative additions to the bathing experience. They were understood as functional components of a process that was, simultaneously, physical cleaning and health maintenance. Small clay pots of rendered fat or herb oil occupied shelves along the bathhouse walls, substances used to condition skin after the stripping effects of hot water and scraping. These preparations, made from animal fat, mixed with plant extracts, and sometimes scented with dried flowers or aromatic resins, serve the same fundamental purpose as modern moisturizing products, replacing the natural oils removed by the cleaning process and protecting the skin's surface. Their presence in the bathhouse environment speaks to a level of attention to skin care that the myth of medieval filth entirely fails to account for. Rough linen cloths, stacked on wooden shelves near the entrance, served as drying towels, their texture coarser than modern equivalents, their absorbency achieved through repeated washing and use rather than any manufacturing refinement. In more prosperous establishments, these cloths might be scented with dried lavender or cedar, stored in wooden chests that imparted their fragrance to the fabric during storage. The provision of clean drying cloths was a mark of the bathhouse's quality and a component of the service that customers paid for. The bathhouse was not simply a washing facility. It was a social environment of considerable complexity. Medieval illuminated manuscripts, those remarkable visual records of daily life, produced in monastery scriptoria and noble households across Europe, depict bathing scenes with a frequency and detail that confirms the bathhouse's centrality to medieval social life. These images show men and women bathing in large wooden tubs, sometimes sharing the water, sometimes separated by wooden partitions, with attendants pouring water and offering food and drink. The manuscripts record a reality that historical sources confirm. The bathhouse was a place where people spent extended time, where social interaction occurred, where business might be conducted, and relationships maintained. The physical layout of bathhouses reflected this social function. Larger establishments incorporated separate areas for different purposes and different clienteles. A main steam room with communal benches, smaller private rooms containing individual wooden tubs for those who could afford the additional cost of privacy, and in some cases a front room or anteroom where customers waited, removed their outer garments, and were received by the bathhouse keeper. The separation of spaces was not merely social, but practical. The steam room required different management than the tub room, and the flow of customers through the building needed to be organized to keep the heating apparatus operating efficiently. The bathhouse keeper, the stovemaster in German-speaking regions, was a skilled tradesperson whose knowledge encompassed the management of fire and water, the preparation of herbal additives, the maintenance of the building's heating infrastructure, and the social management of a busy commercial environment. The physical tools of this trade were visible throughout the bathhouse. Long iron pokers for managing the fire beneath the heating cauldron, wooden paddles for stirring large volumes of water, iron ladles for transferring hot water between vessels, and the bundles of fresh or dried herbs that were the bathhouse's most distinctive sensory signature. Historical records from German and French towns document the bathhouse as a regulated commercial establishment, subject to municipal oversight in ways that reveal how seriously medieval urban authorities took its operation. Town records from cities, including Frankfurt, Nuremberg, and Paris, reference bathhouses in the context of licensing, taxation, and the regulation of operating hours. These documents confirm that the bathhouse was not an informal or marginal institution, but a recognized and regulated part of the urban commercial landscape. Its operation governed by rules that protected both its customers and the broader community. As the day drew toward its close, the bathhouse entered its final phase. The fire beneath the heating cauldron was allowed to die down, its fuel exhausted, the iron of the cauldron ticking and contracting as it cooled. The steam that had filled the room for hours began to thin, rising toward the gaps in the roof where it had always found its escape, the low ceiling slowly emerging from the haze that had obscured it through the busy hours of the day. The wooden benches, wet and steaming through the afternoon, began to dry at their edges, the grain of the wood darkening where moisture still clung. The stone floor, worn smooth by the passage of bare feet over decades, glistened with the water that had been ladled, poured, and splashed across it throughout the day. In the corners, small pools collected where the floor's slight irregularities had directed the runoff, shallow, cooling, carrying the faint green color of the herbs that had scented the day's water. The smell of the room at this hour was different from its midday intensity. Softer, more diffuse, the sharp notes of rosemary faded to something gentler. The steam carried fragrance of lavender, now just a memory in the fabric of the wooden walls. The attendant moved through the cooling space with a wooden bucket, collecting the damp linen cloths from their scattered positions, stacking them for washing before the next day's opening. The clay pots of herbed oil were stoppered and returned to their shelves. The wooden scraping tools were rinsed in the last of the cooling water and hung from iron pegs on the wall to dry. The heavy wooden door, when it finally opened to release the last customer into the cold evening street, exhaled one final breath of warm herb-scented air into the night, and then closed, its leather seals pressing tight against the frame, sealing the cooling interior against the dark. The bathhouse would be cold by morning, but the fire would be lit again before dawn. The water would begin its slow heating, and the steam would rise once more toward the blackened ceiling, because in the medieval town, the bathhouse was not a luxury. It was a rhythm, as reliable and as necessary as the market day or the church bell, built into the structure of community life with the same permanence as the stone-lined well at the center of the square. Stone does not forget. In the worn smoothness of a castle garderobe seat, in the polished surface of a lavabo bobo basin, in the sand-scoured flags of a kitchen floor, the physical fabric of a medieval castle carries the accumulated evidence of daily hygiene, practice with a fidelity that no written record can match. To move through a large medieval castle in the 13th or 14th century was to move through a hierarchy of spaces, each with its own relationship to cleanliness, each shaped by the social and practical demands of the people who occupied it. The castle was not a single environment, but a collection of distinct worlds stacked vertically and arranged horizontally within its stone perimeter, and the hygiene practices of each space reflected its position in that hierarchy with remarkable precision. The Great Hall occupied the heart of the castle's social life, a vast high-ceilinged space with stone walls hung with tapestries that served the dual purpose of decoration and insulation. It was the place where the Lord's household gathered to eat, conduct business, receive visitors, and spend the long hours of winter evenings. The floor of the Great Hall was stone, but that stone was rarely visible beneath the rushes that covered it in a deep, fragrant layer. These were not simply dried grass scattered carelessly across the floor. They were a managed surface, fresh rushes laid over older layers, mixed with dried herbs including lavender, meadowsweet, and chamomile, whose volatile oils released into the air when crushed underfoot, masking the inevitable accumulation of food scraps, animal droppings from dogs that roamed freely through the space, and the general organic residue of a room occupied by dozens of people through every hour of the day. The central hearth of the great hall was enormous by the standards of ordinary domestic life, a stone-lined fire pit capable of consuming whole logs. Its heat radiating outward to warm the furthest corners of the space during the coldest months. Above it, the smoke rose toward a louvered opening in the roof, a simple but effective ventilation system that drew combustion gases upward and out while retaining much of the heat below. The walls above the hearth were blackened with years of carbon deposit, a visual record of the fire's constant presence that no amount of cleaning could entirely remove from the porous surface of the stone. The management of the great hall's floor was a regular domestic task assigned to the lower household staff. The rushes were not permanent. They were periodically cleared entirely. The accumulated debris of weeks swept out through the hall's great doors into the courtyard below, and fresh layers laid in their place. The frequency of this renewal varied with the season and the household's resources, but the practice itself was universal in great halls across medieval Europe, a recognized component of household management that appears in domestic accounts and household ordinances from England, France, and the German territories. From the great hall, the castle's interior unfolded through a series of increasingly private spaces, each accessible through the narrow spiral staircases that connected the castle's floors. These staircases were architectural features of considerable practical significance. Their spiral form, always turning in the same direction, was designed to give a right-handed defender the advantage of a free sword arm, while an attacker, ascending from below, was cramped against the central column. But they were also the arteries through which the castle's daily life flowed, the routes along which servants carried water, fuel, food, and waste through the vertical geography of the building, their surfaces worn into smooth, slightly concave depressions by centuries of this daily passage. At the upper levels of the keep, the Lord's private solar chamber represented the most refined hygiene environment within the castle walls. This was a smaller, more intimate space than the Great Hall, a room designed for private occupation rather than public display. Its walls hung with linen or wool hangings that softened both the visual austerity of bare stone and the acoustic hardness of the space. The wooden bed frame that dominated the room was a significant piece of furniture, its construction elevated above floor level on a wooden platform that kept the sleeping surface away from the cold that radiated upward from the stone below. Linen hangings suspended from a wooden frame above the bed created an enclosed sleeping environment, a room within a room that retained body heat through the night and provided a degree of privacy within the household. The bed linens themselves were objects of considerable domestic attention. Linen sheets, washed and bleached to whiteness, were changed with a regularity that reflected the Lord's social status. The cleanliness of bed linen was a visible marker of household quality, and the management of this linen was a skilled domestic responsibility. Historical records from well-documented medieval households indicate that wealthier individuals, as noted in contemporary accounts, would wash and refresh themselves at least twice daily, a practice described as topping and tailing, attending to the face, hands, and feet with water carried to the chamber in ceramic or metal ewers by household servants. The washing arrangements of the castle's private chambers centered on portable equipment rather than fixed infrastructure. A ceramic or pewter ewer, a handled pouring vessel with a narrow spout, and its matching basin formed the standard washing set of the medieval lord's chamber. These objects were often among the most refined possessions in the household, their surfaces decorated with painted or incised patterns, their forms reflecting the aesthetic standards of their period. The ewer held water, heated in the castle kitchens, and carried up through the spiral staircase by servants, a relay chain of labor that connected the fire in the kitchen to the washing basin in the solar, transforming the raw resource of cold well water into the warm water required for comfortable washing. For more substantial bathing, the portable wooden tub was brought to the private chamber and filled by the same relay system. The tub itself was a significant domestic object. Staved wood bound with iron hoops, its interior sometimes lined with linen cloth to protect the bather's skin from splinters and to retain heat more effectively. Filling it required multiple cauldrons of heated water carried from the kitchen, a labor-intensive process that made bathing in the private chamber a planned event rather than a spontaneous one. Small iron braziers positioned near the tub provided supplementary heat, their glowing coals warming the immediate air and slowing the cooling of the water during the bathing process. The linen towels used in the castle's private chambers were objects of domestic pride, embroidered with household crests or decorative borders, their quality reflecting the status of the household that produced them. The management of household linen was a significant domestic responsibility, its washing and maintenance requiring the same labor infrastructure of water, heat, and physical effort that characterized all medieval laundry, but performed at a scale and with an attention to quality that distinguished the great household from the ordinary one. The most architecturally distinctive hygiene feature of the medieval castle was the garderobe, a stone latrine built directly into the thickness of the castle wall, its presence announced from outside by the slight projection of masonry that accommodated its shaft. The garderobe was not an afterthought or a crude expedient. It was a planned architectural feature, incorporated into the castle's design from the earliest stages of construction. Its position carefully considered, in relation to the rooms it served and the external wall through which its shaft descended. Entering a garderobe was entering a space of particular sensory character. Time equals sign 900 millisections. The stone walls pressed close on either side. These were narrow spaces, barely wide enough for a single person, carved from the thickness of walls that might be several feet deep. The stone seat, worn smooth by generations of use, was cold to the touch. Regardless of the season, the thermal mass of the surrounding masonry conducting heat away from any surface that rested against it. Narrow window slits cut through the outer wall provided ventilation, thin blades of cold outside air that carried the smell of the shaft upward and out but also admitted the cold and the sound of wind against the castle's exterior. Below the seat, the shaft descended through the wall's thickness to its terminus. A pit dug into the ground at the castle's base, a moat or simply open air above a slope or ditch. The darkness of the shaft was absolute, its smell pervasive, its stone surfaces stained with the accumulated evidence of centuries of use. The smell that permeated the stonework surrounding a garderobe was not easily removed. It penetrated the porous surface of the stone and persisted despite the ventilation provided by the window slits, becoming part of the permanent olfactory character of the spaces adjacent to these features. The name garderobe, literally meaning wardrobe or place to keep garments, is believed to reflect the practice of storing clothing in or near these spaces, where the strong ammonia smell rising from the shaft below was thought to repel the moths and insects that damaged stored wool and linen. Whether this practice was widespread or merely incidental, the name preserves a detail of domestic life that illuminates the pragmatic relationship medieval people maintained with the less pleasant aspects of their physical environment, finding utility in what could not be eliminated. The castle's kitchen was a hygiene environment of a different character entirely, a space where cleanliness was a practical necessity rather than a social marker enforced by the demands of food preparation and the management of fire, metal, and organic matter at scale. The stone floors of castle kitchens were scrubbed regularly with sand and water, the abrasive action of fine river sand against stone removing the grease, blood, and food residue that accumulated through the day's cooking. The smooth, slightly worn surface of a well-maintained kitchen floor was the physical record of this practice, its texture different from the rougher stone of less used spaces. Iron and copper cookware were scoured with river sand and ash, the same combination of abrasive and alkaline material that served laundry and floor cleaning throughout the medieval world. The large wooden preparation tables that occupied the center of castle kitchens were scraped clean after each use with flat iron blades, their surfaces worn into slight concavities. By years of this practice, the wood grain raised and smoothed in alternating patterns that recorded the direction and pressure of the scraping tool. The kitchen's relationship with cleanliness was fundamentally practical. Contaminated food caused illness, and the castle's lord and household depended on the kitchen staff's maintenance of standards that protected the health of everyone who ate from those surfaces. The castle's exterior drainage systems completed the picture of a building designed with water management as a fundamental architectural concern. Carved stone gargoyles, those distinctive projecting figures that modern observers often read as purely decorative, served the essential practical function of directing rainwater away from the castle's walls. By projecting the water's fall outward from the wall's face, they prevented the slow erosion of mortar joints that standing water would have caused, protecting the structural integrity of the masonry, while simultaneously managing the flow of precipitation across the building's exterior surfaces. Open channels cut into the paving of castle courtyards directed surface water toward drains and away from doorways and foundations. These channels were not merely functional. Their cutting and maintenance required skilled labor and represented a deliberate investment in the management of the castle's immediate environment. The moat that surrounded many castles served its famous defensive purpose, but it also functioned as the ultimate destination for the castle's waste streams. The runoff from courtyards, the contents of garderobe shafts, the drainage from kitchens and stables, all found their way, directly or indirectly, into the moat's dark water. The castle, read as a hygiene environment, rather than purely as a military or social structure, reveals itself as a remarkably sophisticated system, one in which the management of water, waste and cleanliness was built into the architecture at every level, from the engineered water systems that drew well water to upper floors, to the garderobe shafts that removed waste from living spaces, to the kitchen floors scrubbed daily with sand and water. It was a system shaped by the same fundamental constraints that governed hygiene everywhere in the medieval world. The absence of pressurized running water, the cost of fuel for heating, the labor required to move water through a vertical building. But within those constraints, it represented a level of hygienic ambition and architectural ingenuity that the myth of medieval filth entirely fails to acknowledge. Long before the castle's stone walls rose above the tree line, long before the bathhouse announced itself with columns of rising steam, the vast majority of medieval Europeans were already awake, kneeling beside a shared well, scrubbing their faces in cold water, beginning the daily labor of cleanliness with nothing more than a clay pot, a wooden comb, and the knowledge passed down through generations of survival. The peasant village was the defining human environment of medieval Europe, not the castle, not the cathedral town, not the monastery with its carved stone channels and engineered cisterns, but the cluster of low, dark, Paten-Kilb's smoke-filled structures that housed perhaps 90% of the medieval European population in conditions that modern observers would find almost incomprehensibly difficult. Understanding hygiene in this environment requires abandoning entirely the frameworks of modern domestic life and entering a world where cleanliness was not a comfort but a nigh survival strategy, practiced with ingenuity and persistence against obstacles that were structural, seasonal, and relentless. A typical peasant village of the 13th or 14th century presented itself to the eye as a low, organic arrangement of structures that seemed to grow from the earth, rather than to have been deliberately constructed upon it. The buildings were timber-framed, their walls filled with wattle and daub, woven branches packed with a mixture of clay, straw, and animal dung that dried into a surprisingly effective insulating material, the one that cracked in dry summers and absorbed moisture in wet winters. Thatched roofs of straw or reed descended steeply to low eaves, their undersides dark with smoke and alive with the insects and small animals that colonized the warm sheltered space between thatch and ceiling. The structures were low. A tall person might brush the roof beam with an outstretched hand, and their interiors were dim. Even at midday, the small windows covered with oiled parchment or wooden shutters that admitted little of the grey northern light. The earthen floor was the defining surface of the peasant interior. Packed hard by years of foot traffic, it was not the clean, stable surface that the word floor implies to a modern reader. It absorbed moisture from below when the water table rose in wet seasons, becoming soft and slightly yielding underfoot. It harbored insects in its upper layers, fleas, beetles, and the larvae of flies that found the organic warmth of the inhabited space hospitable. Rushes and dried herbs were spread across it in layers, serving the same function as in the great hall of the castle, but managed with fewer resources and less frequency. A surface treatment that absorbed some moisture, released some fragrance when crushed, and provided a slight thermal barrier between the cold earth and bare feet. When these layers became too saturated with the accumulated residue of daily life, they were swept out through the low doorway and replaced with fresh material gathered from the surrounding fields and hedgerows. The central hearth dominated the interior of every peasant dwelling. Unlike the great hall's hearth with its louvered roof opening, or the later medieval fireplace with its built chimney, the peasant hearth was simply a fire burning on a raised stone platform in the middle of the room, its smoke rising freely toward the thatch above. There was no chimney. The smoke found its way out through gaps in the thatch, through the spaces around the door frame, through the cracks in the wattle and daub walls. But before it escaped, it filled the interior with a permanent, eye-stinging haze that coated every surface with a thin film of carbon and deposited its residue on the skin, hair, and clothing of everyone who lived within. The walls of a peasant dwelling were black with years of this accumulation, their surfaces recording the history of every fire that had burned in the room below. Into this smoky, low-ceiling space add the animals. In the coldest months of winter, livestock pigs, chickens, and sometimes cattle were brought inside the dwelling or into an attached byre that shared a wall with a human living space. The body heat of animals was a significant thermal resource in a world where fuel was precious, and the cold was genuinely life-threatening, and the pragmatic decision to share living space with livestock was not a sign of indifference to cleanliness, but of rational prioritization of survival. The dung of these animals mixed with the earthen floor, with the rushes, with the mud tracked in from the lanes outside, creating a biological complexity in the floor surface that modern sanitation has made entirely unimaginable. As a domestic reality. Outside the dwelling, the lanes between homes were similarly complex environments. Pigs moved freely through the village, performing the function of living waste processors, consuming kitchen scraps, organic refuse, and the biological residue of daily life with an efficiency that made them genuinely valuable members of the village's waste management system. Chickens scratched through the same lanes, consuming insects and seeds. The dung of all these animals mixed with the mud of unpaved lanes, creating a surface that was navigated daily by the same people who then entered their homes, sat at their tables, and prepared their food. The boundary between outside and inside, between clean and contaminated, was porous in ways that modern domestic architecture has made structurally impossible. Against this environment, the hygiene practices of medieval peasants take on a different character entirely when examined closely. Historical research has consistently challenged the assumption that peasants were indifferent to cleanliness, revealing instead a population that maintained personal hygiene with considerable regularity given the constraints of their circumstances. Most peasants performed what might be described as a daily top and tail wash, scrubbing the face, underarms, scrubbing the face, underarms, and nether regions with water carried from the shared well or nearby stream. This was not a full immersion bath, but it was a deliberate, daily act of personal cleaning that required water, effort, and the intention to maintain bodily cleanliness as a regular practice. The physical objects of peasant hygiene were simple but purposeful. Coarse linen undergarments, the layer of clothing worn directly against the skin, were among the most frequently washed items in the peasant household. This reflected an understanding, whether explicitly articulated or simply practiced, that the garment closest to the body accumulated the most biological residue and required the most frequent cleaning. Outer garments of wool or heavier linen were washed less frequently. The labor of washing and drying heavy wool in a cold, damp climate was considerable, and the garments themselves were more resistant to the accumulation of visible soiling. But the linen undergarment, light enough to wash and dry relatively quickly, was laundered with a regularity that speaks to a genuine domestic priority placed on the cleanliness of the skin's immediate environment. Wooden combs were among the most universal personal hygiene tools of the peasant household. Carved from dense hardwoods, boxwood, yew, and bone were common materials. These implements served the dual function of managing hair and removing the lice and nits that were an unavoidable presence in the densely occupied, poorly ventilated spaces of medieval village life. Lice were not a marker of unusual filth in the medieval world. They were a biological reality of close human habitation in spaces that could not be fully cleaned of the organic material that supported insect populations. The wooden comb was the primary tool of resistance against this reality, used daily with a thoroughness that the archaeological record confirms. Combs survive in significant numbers from medieval contexts, their tines worn and sometimes repaired, evidence of sustained and valued use. The soap substitute available to medieval peasants was a small clay pot of rendered animal fat mixed with ash, a primitive but chemically functional cleaning agent that combined the emulsifying properties of fat with the alkaline action of ash residue. This preparation was not soap in the technical sense. True soap required the controlled saponification of fat with lye, but it performed a similar cleaning function, loosening grease and dirt from skin and fabric through a combination of mechanical action and chemical interaction. The production of this preparation was a domestic task, requiring only the fat rendered from cooking and the ash accumulated in the hearth, both resources present in every peasant household as byproducts of daily life, transformed by simple processing into a cleaning agent that cost nothing but the labor of making it. Bundles of dried herbs hung from the rafters of peasant dwellings served multiple functions simultaneously. Lavender, rosemary, mint, and wormwood, the same plants that scented the water of the urban bathhouse, were gathered from hedgerows, field margins, and kitchen gardens and dried for winter use. Hung near the hearth, their volatile oils released slowly into the smoky interior air, providing a fragrance that moderated the ambient smell of the occupied space. Placed among stored clothing and bedding, they were understood to repel the moths and insects that damaged fabric. Strewn among the floor rushes, they released their scent when crushed underfoot. The herb bundle was among the most versatile and most valued tools of peasant domestic management, a single object serving olfactory, practical, and perhaps medicinal functions simultaneously. The village's relationship with water was structured around two primary sources: the shared well at the settlement center and the nearby stream or pond that served as the site of heavier washing work. The well provided drinking water, and the water for daily personal washing, its stone rim, worn smooth by the same daily contact that characterized wells throughout the medieval world. Its rope and bucket, maintained by communal agreement and communal labor. The stream or pond served the laundry, the site where wet fabric was beaten against flat stones, where linen was rinsed in flowing water, where the heavier cleaning work of the household was performed in the open air, regardless of the season's temperature. Seasonal flooding was a double-edged reality in the peasant village's relationship with water. The spring floods that followed winter's snowmelt swept through the lanes of low-lying villages with a thoroughness that no deliberate cleaning effort could match, carrying away the accumulated organic matter of winter, flushing the drainage channels, depositing fresh silt across the earthen surfaces of yards and lanes. This natural cleaning event was simultaneously a catastrophe and a renewal, damaging to structures and stored goods, but genuinely effective at resetting the biological environment of the village in ways that reduced the insect and pathogen load of the surrounding space. Medieval peasants understood this duality and managed around it as best they could, elevating stored goods above expected flood levels and accepting the annual inundation as part of the seasonal rhythm of village life. The outdoor latrine of the peasant village was a simple structure, a wooden frame of upright posts and a roof of woven wicker or thatch positioned over a dug pit at a distance from the dwelling, calculated to keep the smell manageable and the contamination of the water supply minimal. The floor of packed earth around the pit opening, the walls of woven wicker that provided visual privacy without fully enclosing the space, the cold air moving through the gaps in the wicker walls. These were the physical characteristics of a sanitation facility that was basic by any standard, but represented a deliberate separation of human waste from living space that reflected genuine understanding of the relationship between waste and health. The positioning of these structures downwind of homes was not accidental. It reflected an empirical understanding of smell management that, while not articulated in the theoretical terms of germ theory, achieved a practically similar result, keeping the most biologically active waste products of human occupation at a distance from the spaces where food was prepared and people slept. The pit beneath the latrine was periodically emptied, its contents spread on agricultural fields as fertilizer, a closed-loop resource management practice that transformed human waste into agricultural productivity with a pragmatic efficiency that modern waste management systems have only recently begun to reconsider. Animals played a complex role in the hygiene environment of the peasant village that extended beyond their function as waste producers. Cats and dogs, present in virtually every medieval household, served as active pest controllers. Cats hunting the mice and rats that consumed stored grain and spread disease. Dogs consuming kitchen scraps and providing a first line of defense against the rodent populations that thrived in the organic warmth of inhabited spaces. Their presence inside homes was not merely companionable, but functional, their pest control activities reducing the insect and rodent load of the interior environment in ways that directly supported the household's hygiene. The chickens that scratched through village lanes consumed the insects that bred in organic waste. Waste reducing the fly populations that spread disease between the waste deposits of the lane and the food surfaces of the kitchen. The pigs that routed through the same lanes consumed organic matter that would otherwise have accumulated and decomposed in place, their digestive systems processing biological waste into a form that was less immediately hazardous than the raw material they consumed. The village's animal population was, in this sense, a distributed biological waste management system. Imperfect, uncontrolled, and generating its own waste streams, but performing genuine environmental services that reduced the overall biological hazard of the village environment. What emerges from a close examination of the peasant village as a hygiene environment is not the picture of passive filth that popular imagination has constructed, but something more complex and more human. It is a picture of people managing a genuinely difficult environment with the tools and knowledge available to them, maintaining personal cleanliness through daily washing routines, managing their clothing through regular laundering of the garments closest to the skin, using herbs and ash and animal fat to clean surfaces and bodies, and organizing their physical environment to separate waste from living space as effectively as their resources allowed. The smoke-filled interior, the earthen floor, the proximity of livestock. These were not chosen conditions, but inherited ones, the physical reality of a world in which the resources required to build differently were not available to the vast majority of the population. Within those conditions, the evidence suggests not resignation, but adaptation, a persistent, practical, daily engagement with cleanliness that used every available resource and reflected a genuine understanding that hygiene mattered, even when achieving it required effort that modern life has made entirely invisible. Before the first soap bar hardened in its wooden mold, before the first lye dripped from the base of a leaching barrel, before the first bundle of lavender was hung from a drying rack in a stone-floored storeroom, the knowledge of how to clean existed. It existed in the hands of the people who grew the plants, rendered the fat, and tended the ash pits, carried forward through generations as practical wisdom, encoded in daily labor, rather than written instruction. The monastery herb garden was among the most deliberately managed spaces in the medieval world. Rows of raised stone beds, their edges carefully mortared to retain the enriched soil within, contained a pharmacopoeia of plants selected over centuries for their documented properties, medicinal, culinary, and cleaning. On a cold morning in early autumn, the garden presented itself as a study in controlled abundance. The silver-grey mounds of lavender, heavy with dried flower heads, the upright spires of rosemary, dark and resinous, the spreading mats of thyme releasing their sharp volatile oils at the slightest pressure of a passing foot, the feathery grey-green leaves of wormwood standing stiff in the morning air, the bright spreading runners of mint contained within their stone borders, and the low cushions of chamomile, whose crushed flowers released a scent like warm apples into the cold. The scents of this garden were not merely pleasant. They were understood within the intellectual framework of medieval natural philosophy as evidence of the plant's active properties, their capacity to act upon the physical world in ways that extended beyond their visible form. Lavender's fragrance was associated with cleanliness and the repulsion of insects. Rosemary's sharp, penetrating scent was understood to purify the air of spaces where illness had been present. Wormwood's bitter, medicinal smell was documented as effective against the moths and parasites that damaged stored fabric and troubled inhabited spaces. Mint's cooling intensity was used to freshen water and mask the ambient odors of enclosed environments. These were not superstitions. They were empirical observations of use, accumulated over centuries of use, that correctly identified the volatile compounds in these plants as biologically active agents. The harvest of the herb garden was a seasonal labor performed with deliberate care. Stems were cut at the point of peak aromatic intensity, typically just before or at the moment of flowering, when the plant's volatile oil content was highest. These cut stems were gathered into bundles, their ends tied with linen cord, and carried to the stone-floored storerooms that adjoined the garden. There, they were hung from wooden drying racks, simple structures of horizontal poles suspended from ceiling beams, where the cool, brutal, dry air of the storeroom drew moisture from the plant material over days and weeks, concentrating the aromatic compounds in the drying leaves and flowers. The storeroom at harvest time was a space of extraordinary olfactory richness, the combined fragrance of dozens of drying herb bundles, filling the low-ceiling space with a layered complexity that was simultaneously the smell of cleanliness, medicine, and the particular domestic intelligence of the medieval world. Time =, 1500 milliseconds. From the storeroom, dried herbs moved through the monastery and beyond into the broader world of medieval cleaning practice. They were added to the water used for bathing and laundry, releasing their volatile compounds into the liquid and the steam. They were strewn among stored clothing and bedding, their scent deterring the insects that damaged fabric. They were burned in enclosed spaces to purify the air, a practice documented in monastic records and household accounts across medieval Europe. The smoke of burning rosemary or juniper understood to cleanse the atmosphere of rooms where illness had been present. Hair was cleaned with water sometimes mixed with ash, and herbs to make it shiny and sweet-smelling, and daily combing was considered an important component of personal hygiene. A practice that combined the mechanical removal of debris with the distribution of herbal preparations through the hair's length. Behind every medieval home, from the monastery to the peasant cottage, the ash pit was the other great resource of the cleaning world. It was not a waste deposit, but a productive accumulation, the slow gathering of wood ash from the hearth fire, collected day by day in clay pots and earthenware vessels, collected day by day in clay pots and earthenware vessels, building over weeks and months into a resource of considerable chemical power. Wood ash is rich in potassium carbonate and calcium carbonate, alkaline compounds that, when dissolved in water, create a solution capable of breaking down grease, dissolving organic matter, and killing the microorganisms that cause fabric to smell and surfaces to harbor disease. Medieval people did not describe this chemistry in these terms, but they understood its effects with a precision born of long experience, and they exploited it with a systematic thoroughness that reveals a sophisticated practical knowledge of cleaning chemistry. The leaching barrel was the instrument through which ash was transformed into lye, made from a hollowed log or from staved wood bound with iron hoops. It was a vessel of simple construction, but precise function. A small hole near its base, sometimes fitted with a wooden plug, served as the outlet for the liquid produced within. The barrel was packed with alternating layers of wood, ash, and straw, the straw serving as a filter that prevented the ash particles from passing into the collected liquid, while allowing the dissolved alkaline compounds to percolate freely downward. Water was poured over the packed ash from above, and the process of leaching began. A slow, gravity-driven extraction that might take hours or days to produce a useful volume of lye. The liquid that dripped from the barrel's base was pale and slightly oily in appearance, with a sharp, biting smell that caught in the throat. Its caustic quality was immediately apparent to the touch. Prolonged contact with skin produced a burning sensation, a physical reminder of the chemical power that made it so effective as a cleaning agent. Medieval householders tested the strength of their lye with a method that was both elegant and empirically sound. A feather placed on the surface of the liquid would float if the lye was strong enough for use, and sink if the solution required further concentration. This test worked because a sufficiently alkaline solution has a surface tension and density that supports the feather's weight, a physical fact that medieval practitioners had identified through observation, without any theoretical framework to explain it. Lye was used directly in laundry, added to the water in which fabric was soaked, and boiled to strip grease and biological matter from the weave of the cloth. Urine and white ash combined to form an ammonia-rich lye that was particularly valued for its cleaning power. The ammonia produced by the fermentation of urine adding a second alkaline compound to the solution's cleaning action. The collection of urine for this purpose was a routine domestic practice. The clay pots used for this collection, a standard feature of the medieval household's cleaning equipment. This was not a crude or desperate measure. It was a chemically informed practice that exploited a freely available resource with a pragmatic efficiency characteristic of medieval domestic economy at its most sophisticated. The production of true soap, the controlled chemical reaction between fat and lye that produces the sodium or potassium salts of fatty acids, was a specialized craft practiced in medieval towns by dedicated soap makers whose workshops were recognizable by their smell, their smoke, and the large iron cauldrons that dominated their interiors. The soap maker's workshop was a space shaped entirely by its industrial function. The floor was stone, worn smooth by years of foot traffic and the constant presence of spilled liquid. The walls were darkened with the smoke of the fires that burned continuously beneath the production cauldrons. The smell was complex and not entirely pleasant. The sharp alkaline bite of lye mixing with the fatty, most harp alkaline bite of lye, slightly rancid smell of rendered animal fat in the early stages of the saponification process, transforming over hours of heating and stirring into the cleaner, more neutral smell of finished soap. The rendering of animal fat was the first stage of soap production, a process performed either in the soap maker's workshop or in the slaughterhouses and kitchens that supplied the raw material. Fat trimmed from carcasses was placed in large iron vessels over low heat, the solid fat slowly liquefying and separating from the connective tissue and impurities that surrounded it. The clear liquid fat was ladled off and stored in clay vessels, cooled to a pale solid that could be transported and stored before use. This rendered fat, tallow from cattle and sheep, lard from pigs, was the primary raw material of the soap maker's craft, its fatty acid composition determining the properties of the finished soap. The combination of rendered fat and lye in the production cauldron was a process requiring sustained attention and physical labor. The two components were combined in proportions that the soap maker understood through experience rather than calculation, and the mixture was stirred continuously over heat for hours. The long wooden paddles used for this work worn smooth at their working ends by years of this labor. The chemical reaction between fat and lye was exothermic, generating its own heat as it proceeded, and the soap maker read the state of the mixture through its changing appearance and consistency. The shift from a separated oily mixture to a smooth, thickening emulsion that signaled the saponification process was complete. Salt was often added at this stage. Causing the soap to separate from the remaining lye solution and rise to the surface of the cauldron as a solid mass that could be scooped out and transferred to wooden molds. The wooden molds where soap was poured and left to harden were simple rectangular frames, their interiors lined with damp cloth to prevent adhesion. The soap cooled slowly in these molds over days, its surface hardening first, while the interior remained soft, the chemical reaction continuing slowly as the mass cooled. When fully hardened, the soap was turned out of its mold as a large rectangular block cut into individual bars with a wire or thin blade and carried to cool, dry cellars where it was stored on wooden shelves to cure, a process of continued drying and chemical stabilization that improved the soap's hardness, lather quality, and shelf life. The finished bars, pale and slightly waxy in appearance, with a clean alkaline smell that carried faint traces of the herbs sometimes added to the production mixture, were objects of genuine domestic value, traded at markets, purchased by households that could afford them, and used with a careful economy that reflected their cost in labor and materials. Sand and river gravel occupied a different position in the medieval cleaning toolkit. Not chemical agents, but mechanical ones, their cleaning action achieved through abrasion rather than dissolution. Fine river sand collected from the banks of streams, where water action had reduced it to a consistent particle size, was spread across stone floors and worked into their surfaces with stiff brushes or bare feet, its abrasive action lifting the embedded grease and organic matter that accumulated in the pores of the stone. The scratching sound of this process, sand grains dragged across stone under pressure, was a characteristic sound of the medieval kitchen and great hall at cleaning time. Its rhythm as familiar to medieval ears as the sound of the hearth fire or the creak of the well rope. The same sand was used to scour metal cookware, the iron and copper vessels of the castle kitchen and the monastery refectory, whose surfaces accumulated a buildup of carbonized food, grease, and mineral deposits that water alone could not remove. Applied with a linen cloth or a bundle of straw, fine river sand removed this buildup through mechanical action. Its particles, small enough to work into the curved surfaces of pots and cauldrons without scratching deeply into the metal. The smooth, worn patches on stone surfaces throughout medieval buildings, on kitchen floors, on the edges of washing basins, on the stone seats of garderobes, are the physical record of this abrasive cleaning practice. The stone itself slowly yielding to the accumulated pressure of thousands of cleaning sessions over decades and centuries. The apothecary's shop was the final destination in the chain of medieval cleaning substances, the place where the most refined and specialized preparations were available to those with the means to purchase them. The physical environment of the medieval apothecary was distinctive and immediately recognizable. Shelves of ceramic jars, their surfaces painted, or incised with the names of their contents in abbreviated Latin, lined the walls from floor to ceiling. The jars contained a remarkable range of materials, powdered minerals including pumice and chalk, used as abrasive cleaning agents, dried plant matter, including the same herbs that grew in monastery gardens, but prepared and concentrated for specific applications, rendered fats mixed with aromatic resins for skin conditioning, and preparations of beeswax combined with plant extracts for the treatment and waterproofing of leather and fabric. The smell of the apothecary's shop was a concentrated version of the herb storeroom's fragrance. The same volatile compounds present in greater density, mixed with the mineral smell of powdered stone, the sweet heaviness of beeswax, and the sharp alkaline note of the various lye-based preparations, stored in sealed ceramic vessels. The low-ceilinged space, its wooden beams hung with dried herb bundles and strings of dried roots, its counter worn smooth by years of transactions, was a place where the practical knowledge of cleaning substances intersected with the theoretical knowledge of the medieval natural philosopher, where the empirical wisdom of the herb garden and the ash pit met the more systematized understanding of the trained apothecary. Pumice, the porous volcanic stone, whose abrasive surface had been used for skin cleaning and surface preparation since antiquity, was available in apothecary shops throughout medieval Europe, traded from volcanic regions in Italy and the Canary Islands through the commercial networks that connected the medieval world across surprising distances. Its presence in the apothecary's inventory, alongside locally produced herbs and ash-based preparations, speaks to the breadth of the medieval cleaning material world, a world that drew on local resources with practical ingenuity, while also participating in long-distance trade networks that brought specialized materials from distant sources to the shelves of shops in northern European towns. While the monastery herb garden, the ash pit, the soap maker's workshop, the riverside sand deposit, and the apothecary's shelves share is a common logic, the logic of transformation. In each of these spaces, raw materials available in the natural world were processed, combined, and refined into cleaning agents of genuine effectiveness. The lavender in the garden became the scented water of the bathhouse. The ash in the hearth became the lye in the leaching barrel. The fat rendered from the slaughterhouse became the soap hardening in its wooden mold. The sand on the riverbank became the abrasive that scoured the kitchen floor. The dried root on the apothecary's shelf became the preparation that conditioned skin and repelled insects. This was not primitive chemistry. It was sophisticated empirical knowledge, accumulated over centuries of observation and practice, encoded in the daily routines of people who understood, without the theoretical vocabulary of modern science, that certain substances acted upon dirt, grease, and biological matter in ways that made cleaning possible. The medieval cleaning world was built from this knowledge, expressed in the physical objects and spaces where it was practiced. The herb bundle, the leaching barrel, the soap mold, the sand-scoured floor, the ceramic jar on the apothecary's shelf. Each of these objects was a technology, simple in form, sophisticated in its underlying logic, and effective in its purpose. Before the first light of a medieval morning touched the rooftops of a European town, a sound was already moving through the streets below. It was the sound of liquid striking wet cobblestones, sharp, immediate, followed by the soft rush of fluid, finding the path of least resistance toward the central channel that ran down the middle of the lane. The day's first act of waste disposal had begun. The chamber pot was among the most universal objects in the medieval world. Ceramic or wooden, glazed or plain, decorated or entirely functional. These vessels existed beneath beds and in corner alcoves of every sleeping space, from the meanest peasant cottage to the most elaborately appointed royal bedchamber. Their presence was not a mark of poverty or of luxury, but simply of human biology, operating within the physical constraints of a world without plumbing. No one in medieval Europe, regardless of social position, was exempt from the nightly reality of the chamber pot, its use, its smell, and the morning ritual of its emptying. The ceramic versions were the most common in towns and among households with access to the pottery trade. Wheel thrown from local clays, fired in communal kilns, and sold at market stalls, and storage jars. They were sturdy, practical objects whose form had been refined over centuries of use into something close to optimal, a wide mouth for ease of use in darkness, a stable base that resisted tipping, walls thick enough to resist casual impacts of daily handling. Wooden versions turned from dense hardwoods or cooperated from staves like small barrels. Served in households where ceramics were scarce or expensive, their surfaces sealed with rendered fat or pine resin to reduce absorption of liquid into the grain of the wood. The morning ritual of emptying the chamber pot was a domestic act performed with a speed and practicality that left little room for ceremony. In towns, the contents were carried to the window or doorway and discharged into the street below or directly into the drainage channel at the lane's edge. The sound of this discharge, liquid striking cobblestone, the brief splash and spread of fluid across uneven stone surfaces, was a characteristic sound of the medieval urban morning, as familiar and unremarkable to medieval ears as the sound of a modern toilet flushing is to contemporary ones. The smell that rose from the point of impact mixed immediately with the ambient odors of the street, the animal dung of horses and pigs, the wood smoke from newly lit hearths, the damp stone smell of wet cobblestones cooling in morning air, becoming part of the layered sensory environment that defined the medieval town at dawn. Medieval town streets were engineered, however, simply to manage this daily reality. The central channel, known as the kennel, ran down the middle of many streets, a shallow gutter cut into the paving, or simply the lowest point of a slightly cambered road surface, designed to direct liquid waste toward the nearest watercourse. Raised stone curbs along the edges of buildings kept the flow of the kennel from spreading onto doorsteps and into ground floor interiors. The physical evidence of these channels survives in the archaeological record of excavated medieval towns. The worn central depressions in cobbled streets, the slight upward curve of paving toward building frontages, the stone-lined gutters that directed surface water with deliberate engineering toward rivers and streams beyond the town's edge. Rainfall was the kennel's ally and the town's periodic relief. A heavy rain transformed the street's drainage system from a slow-moving accumulation of waste into a flushing mechanism, the volume of water overwhelming the channel's capacity and spreading across the street's surface, carrying the accumulated matter of days toward the river with a thoroughness that no deliberate cleaning effort could match. Medieval town dwellers understood this relationship between rainfall and street cleanliness with a practical intimacy of people whose daily environment depended on it. And the sound of rain on cobblestones carried a different meaning in a medieval town than it does in a modern one. It was the sound of the street cleaning itself. Beyond the chamber pot and the street channel, the deeper infrastructure of medieval waste management centered on the cesspit, a dug chamber beneath castle, monastery, or urban building that received the accumulated waste of the structure above it over months or years. These were not simple holes in the ground. In larger establishments, there were engineered structures, stone-lying chambers of considerable volume, their walls carefully constructed to contain their contents, while allowing some liquid to percolate into the surrounding soil, reducing the rate at which they filled. The guardrobe shafts of castle walls discharged directly into these chambers, as did the drainage channels of monastery raw waters. The communal latrines, built over running water or cesspit, access that served the monastic community's daily needs. The person responsible for emptying these cesspits occupied one of the most physically demanding and socially marginal positions in medieval urban life. Known in England as the gong farmer, the word gong being a medieval term for privy or latrine, this worker performed a task that was essential to the functioning of every large establishment, but was conducted at night, in darkness, with a deliberate invisibility that reflected the social discomfort surrounding the work. Municipal records from London and other English towns document the gong farmer's activities with a specificity that reveals both the scale of the operation and the regulatory framework that governed it. These workers were licensed, their activities scheduled, their disposal sites designated by town authorities who understood the public health implications of uncontrolled waste dumping. The physical environment of the gong farmer's work was defined by the cesspit itself, a space of total darkness, confined dimensions, and an atmospheric concentration of gases produced by the decomposition of organic matter that was genuinely dangerous. The tools of the trade were long-handled iron scoops for reaching into the pit's depths, wooden barrels for collecting the extracted material, and rope systems for hauling both tools and filled barrels up through the narrow access shafts that connected the cesspit to the surface above. The work was performed by teams, the labor divided between those who descended into or reached into the pit and those who managed the rope systems and barrels at the surface, a coordinated operation that required experience and mutual trust in conditions where a mistake could be fatal. The material extracted from cesspit was not simply waste in the modern sense of the word. It was a resource. Night soil, as it came to be called, was recognized throughout the medieval world as a valuable agricultural fertilizer, its nitrogen-rich content understood empirically to improve crop yields in ways that made its collection and transport economically worthwhile. The wooden barrels in which it was hauled from urban cesspits were loaded onto carts and transported to agricultural land surrounding towns, where the contents were spread across fields in a closed-loop system of resource use that connected the waste of urban life to the productivity of the rural economy that fed it. This practice was not unique to medieval Europe. It was ancient, documented across cultures and centuries, a pragmatic response to the agricultural value of human waste that modern sanitation infrastructure has only recently begun to reconsider through the lens of sustainable resource management. The smell that accompanied gong farming operations was, by all historical accounts, extraordinary in its intensity. Municipal regulations in English and French towns specified that this work be conducted only at night, partly to reduce the social disruption of the operation, and partly to minimize the exposure of the general population to the atmospheric conditions that surrounded an opened cesspit. The darkness of the medieval town at night, lit only by the occasional candle behind a shuttered window, the moon when it was present, and the faint glow of banked hearth fires, was the gong farmer's working environment. The narrow streets, navigated by familiarity, and the sound of the cartwheels on cobblestone, rather than by sight. The river received everything that the town's waste management systems could not contain or redirect. At the edge of a medieval town after dark, the river was a different presence than it was at midday. Darker, its surface moving with a slow authority that the daylight hours made visible, but that night reduced to sound and smell. The water caught what light there was, the reflection of a candle in an upper window, the pale smear of moonlight on a slow current, and carried it downstream with the same indifference that it carried everything else the town contributed to its flow. The smell of the river at this hour carried the full complexity of medieval urban life. The organic richness of the water, fed by the runoff of tanneries and slaughterhouses upstream, by the drainage channels of streets, but the outflow of cesspits positioned too close to the bank, was not the clean mineral smell of a mountain stream, but something denser and more biological. A smell that spoke of the accumulated biological activity of thousands of human lives conducted in close proximity to this single watercourse. And yet this same river was also the source of the water that filled the morning's buckets at the washing stones downstream. Downstream, the water that was carried to hearth and heated in iron cauldrons, the water that eventually reached the ceramic basins where hands and faces were washed at the start of each new day. This was the fundamental paradox of medieval waste management. The same water system that received the town's waste also supplied its cleaning water. The same river that carried away the contents of cesspits and street channels also provided the medium through which cleanliness was pursued. Medieval people navigated this paradox with a practical awareness of upstream and downstream, of the direction of current and the distance between waste outfall and water collection. Point that represented a genuine, if empirically, rather than theoretically grounded understanding of contamination and its management. The architecture of waste in the medieval world was not the absence of system, but the presence of a different system, one built from cesspits and chamber pots, from gong farmers and kennel channels, from the flushing action of rainfall and the agricultural value of night soil. It was a system shaped by the same fundamental constraints that governed all medieval hygiene: the absence of pressurized water infrastructure, the cost of labor, and the pragmatic necessity of finding use for every available resource. Within those constraints, it managed the biological reality of dense human habitation with an ingenuity that deserves recognition rather than the simple disgust that the myth of medieval filth has too long substituted for genuine understanding.